Welcome to the Swedish launch of the special report on human security by the Human Development Report Office. We are hosted by UNDP Sweden here in Stockholm. My name is Carolina Eklöf and I work for SIPRI. This seminar series takes place under the theme of reimagining development, and that is exactly what we are here to do today. Reimagine what the future of development may look like and how we may approach the global challenges that we face today. But before we begin the panel discussion, we will get an introduction to the report itself by the head of the Human Development Report Office, Pedro Conizao. You can press play.
Hello colleagues, I'm delighted to be joining the launch in Sweden of the special report on human security. Thank you State Secretary, thank you Vice Chancellor of the Swedish Defense University, and thank you Ulrika, and also Carolina from SIPRI, our good partner, not only in this report but in many other activities in our office. I could actually say that the special report on human security was born in Stockholm because it was conversations in Stockholm with colleagues in SIPRI, the Stockholm Resilience Center, the Swedish authorities, that we came to be more concerned about a context where we see that we have very advanced societies, people living longer lives than ever, being rich, of course, with many inequalities still, but at the same time, there's a pervasive sense of anxiety, uneasiness about the future. And that led us to reflect or to ask the question of whether this notion of human security that was introduced in the 1994 Human Development Report would have something to tell us. In helping us to understand the challenges we are confronting today, this reality, and also to offer a way forward. So the notion of human security is basically translating the idea that it's important for people to be living free from want, certainly, but also free from fear and free from living in dignity. And of course, this resonates very clearly the messages not only of the United Nations Charter, but also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what the special report found is that we're actually not doing that well when it comes to human security. The report documents that 6 out of every 7 people around the world are feeling insecure about many aspects of their lives. And moreover, we find that there is a very strong association between people feeling insecure and people not trusting in one another. So the strong association between feeling insecure, human insecurity, and lack of trust perhaps offers a way forward to understand how we can increase trust, which is something important in, for instance, the Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda. Enhancing human security can offer us a way forward to enhance trust. The report argues that actually people feel insecure for very good reasons. There are good objective reasons for why people are feeling insecure. We think that the reasons relate to the intersection from what we call the Anthropocene reality on the one hand, and a number of inequalities that are interacting with this Anthropocene reality. So the Anthropocene is a term that is not fully established in the scientific community, but we find it useful to reflect a world that is becoming dangerous as a result of actions that we humans take. This is reflected, for instance, in climate change, in more frequent zoonotic diseases, of which COVID-19 may be the latest example. And this new reality exacerbates and interacts with inequalities between those that contribute to these dangerous changes in our planet and those suffering the consequences. So the report, special report on human security, argues that this is the underlying reason and then goes on to explore how this is manifest in many ways that threaten people's human security, from food systems to forced displacement to implications for violent conflict and a few other aspects. But the report ultimately, at least in my view, is a hopeful report, is a report that suggests a way forward. It starts by reaffirming the importance of looking at human security by implementing strategies that enhance people's empowerment and protection. And this was already something emphasized by Sadako Ogata and Amartya Sen in their 2003 report, Human Security Now. But we suggest that there are two evolutions that may be warranted. First, there is a blind spot in how we conceive and understand and measure development by looking at well-being achievements and neglecting agencies. So this notion that people can be seen or should be seen not only as patients, or should not be seen as patients, but actually as agents able to make different choices, to course correct, to lead us in a different direction. And the second element that the report suggests is that it's important to complement this notion of strategies leading up to people's being more empowered and being protected, but also having a sense of solidarity. Solidarity not as something optional, something charitable, or something that subsumes the individual to the interest of a collective, but really an affirmation of our common humanity, of our interdependence as people, as countries, with one another, but also between ourselves and the planet. So our hope is that this enhanced approach to human security can help us to make progress towards meeting the aspirations of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for giving us this introduction. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists that we have with us today. That is State Secretary for International Development, Jenny Olsson. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
We also have Vice Chancellor Robert Egnell with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Of the Swedish Defense University. And with us from New York, we have Assistant Secretary General to the UN, Ulrika Moder. Warm welcome.
Good to be with you.
Good to be with you too. So we just got this introduction to the report by Pedro himself, and I would like to just ask you on quick reactions, first thoughts. What does this report mean? We can start with you, Jenny.
Well, thank you, Carolina. I mean, first of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to this conversation. The Human Development Report and special reports like this are really important policy guiding tools for us in the government. So thank you very much. I mean, we need this kind of input to shape our thoughts and sometimes also challenge our mindsets. So I think that the findings of this human security report is very interesting and important, but also very worrying. It surprised me, some of the numbers here. I mean, 6 out of 7 people globally feel insecure. I mean, it's truly frightening because we know that fear or the feeling of insecurity, it shapes a lot of our thinking, our decisions, how we act. So it's interesting and worrying. And if I'm allowed, can I also add some other comments here? I mean, some aspect I particularly thought about when I read it. It's from a Swedish perspective, of course, interesting to look at the gender aspects of this. And the difference between the level of insecurity felt when you compare women and young girls and boys and men, it's really a problem. And I mean, we know that from before. There is many areas, climate change, conflict, economy, health, where there is a difference in the between the genders. So I think this report clearly showed that, and it's very worrying. And I also wanted to to point out that the perception of insecurity has increased for most countries with comparable data, and that change is registered across all the groups. I mean, also that some of the largest increases were in countries ranked very high on the Human Development Index. I mean, this is really interesting, I think. And it's a paradox. Despite the progress in the traditional indicators of well-being, people generally feel increasingly insecure. I mean, there's a lot to think about when we read these numbers. So, those are some initial comments from my side.
Thank you, Jenny. I agree on the paradox. It's mind-boggling. If we move to you, Robert, what would be your reactions and thoughts on this report?
First of all, I'm really excited about the report. There are so many things I would like to discuss. In the conceptual development, the findings in the data, etc., etc. But I think my first reaction is how important the human security concept itself is. Because looking at this from a strict development lens, it doesn't make any sense that people would be more insecure. From a strict security sense, there are also fewer people dying of wars than almost any point in history. So that would also not make any sense. But human security captures something else. It captures people's feelings of insecurity, and it also asks them to think about security in much broader terms, not just is there a threat to our country or is there a military threat, but rather are there any type of threat to me? And that captures then perhaps a little bit of the paradox, because what I think we need to discuss is this feeling of, are people actually right in feeling this insecure at this point in history? And if so, why? And if they are right, then what is it? Is it the external sort of factors of development or security, or is it this sense of loss of control of what is happening that is perhaps the Anthropocene dilemma, that even though I'm rich and I feel secure in terms of military or criminal issues, the planet is dying, and there is no agency for me to engage in that issue. I can't educate myself more, I can't spend any more money. It's happening regardless. And then the question is that also part of what fuels this insecurity, and how do we tackle that?
Yeah, good points, which you mentioned the Anthropocene, for instance, and I'm sure that you, Ulrika, have been exposed to this concept in the UN lately. And I also, of course, want to ask you, what are your reactions to this report?
So I think that yes, okay, I have an echo here, but let's see how I manage that. What Pedro Cosesau said, that there are also reasons for people to be more insecure. Yes, we have seen a lot of development throughout the past decades, but we have also seen some really concerning trends that the report and also previous human development reports point to, and that is increasing inequality within and also now between societies as a result of the socioeconomic crisis of COVID-19. And then also threats, as discussed here, in relation to climate, but also biodiversity, that really shapes this concept of Anthropocene, that we will not be able to see the human development that we have seen unless we also realize that, yes, there is actually agency. So while people individually may feel insecure about their possibility to actually be part of a change, the whole concept of Anthropocene is actually about human reshaping our future. And of course, if we have been able to reshape and even introduce an entire new geological era, we are also able to turn it into a different direction and see to that we can tackle these challenges. And I think for UNDP, what is important to say is that we are present in 170 countries across the world. And what the human development reports offer us is really this ground for discussion, as Jenny alluded to. And not only discussion, I would say, because we are also in close connection with different actors, of course, with governments and different state agencies, but also different actors at country level, looking at how we can, based on these kind of in discussions, also make change happen for real. So yes, there is a reason for people to feel insecure. But of course, also in these times, we should look closer into, and it's also, of course, being mentioned in the report, the situation of increasing disinformation and misinformation, and how this also shapes the understanding of people's look at their own reality and the possibility to move forward.
Thank you, Ulrika. You mentioned ground for discussion. Jenny, you mentioned that this is challenging existing notions. So my question to you is exactly that. How can a report like this help in driving ideas forward on a policy level, more in practice? What's your perspective on this?
I mean, first of all, I think it is useful. Perhaps not something that can be measured day two after the release of a report. But I mean, first of all, it creates a lot of new thoughts. It challenges, some ideas that we might have had. But it might also really help when you fine-tune strategies and policies. And also something that is really good with these kind of reports from us is that they are based on solid data. And I think that and research, and I mean that really makes it easier for the long-term policy discussion, I think. So we value that a lot, and that's why we're also very happy to be a partner and supporter of the HDR work. But I mean, a reflection, having said that, is that some of the, I think that the report shows that what we are doing from a Swedish perspective, we are in some ways doing the right thing. Things can, of course, be improved and increased. But I mean, our long-term work with issues such as democracy, human rights, climate, rule of law, all these areas, I think, I mean, there are international issues that we need to work together. And they're probably also something that if we succeed will also affect the level of insecurity. But of course, there's a lot of things we can develop and get better at. I'm not contesting that. Something that was interesting to read was that solidarity and agency as strategies is mentioned in the report for promoting human security. And I find that really interesting. Yeah. I mean, from a political perspective, my own party background is from a party where the notion of solidarity has always been high on the agenda. And the report puts forward solidarity as a way to systematically, consider interdependence among people, between people, and also with the planet. So I think that if we are to increase the general level of perceived as well as the actual human security, I mean, the only option is to act collectively and also beyond state borders. So this sounds perhaps banal. We've said it so many times, but threats like climate change and pandemics, it really knows no borders, but it's also at the heart of the problem here. So, I mean, I think they are very challenging, but good examples of how threats can only be dealt with collectively. And put differently, I mean, these challenges, these global challenges, it does provide a good. It's actually an opportunity for multilateralism, for the international, cooperation to step up and show the possibilities of results and change in a way that will eventually affect the level of insecurity. I also wanted to say, I mean, you mentioned also, Ulrika, digital issues, and I think that is something really interesting, how the report includes this analysis of risks related to digital technologies. I believe that there is room for a lot of development in this field, looking at how digital technologies affects our opportunities and our well-being, but also our feeling of insecurity. So I look forward to follow that.
Yeah, you mentioned agency and solidarity, and I'm sure that we will get the opportunity to get back to that, because I think it's an important concept in this particular report. So we heard a bit about the policy and how that works. And you, Robert, you are here from the Swedish Defence University. You have insights in academia and research. So for you, when a report like this is produced, when evidence like this is displayed and data like this becomes available, how can this be used, and what is the meaning of report findings like this?
Well, first of all, I think it raises so many interesting research questions to pursue this further.
Yeah.
Exactly what is it people are afraid of, and does that match their actual conditions? Are the people afraid of climate change, for example, the ones who are most affected by it, or not? Those who are afraid of other things, is there a relationship between their actual situation and their fears or sense of insecurities? That would be interesting further studies into that. But then also, obviously, at the end of the day, the purpose of a concept like human security is to increase our understanding, but also to help us improve the lives of humankind better. So the question then is, how do we operationalize this? How do we do things better? And that's where we also need to discuss quite a lot, because should we then tackle the actual fears or people's sense of security? And are we sure that sense of security is always the actual security that we need to deal with? I remember Newt Gingrich saying, the presidential candidate way back in the US, sort of being challenged because he was drumming up fears about criminality in the US. And he was challenged by a reporter who said, well, actually, the numbers are going down. Well, I'm a politician. I don't care about the numbers. I care about how people feel. And should we say the same thing? Is it actually just about how people feel, or is fear itself part of the problem? Should we tackle that? And how do we do that as politicians or as development workers or in whatever field we work in? And that's a real challenge.
That's a real challenge, and I'm wondering actually if I can follow up on if there's any appetite among the students to pursue these long-term policy questions in research, to think about these, or is there any trend on this?
I think they're way ahead of us, to be honest. The new generation growing up has a different sense of what security means, who it is for, and how to approach it. I think the Fridays for Futures movement is an example of creating agency and solidarity to an extent that we just haven't seen in previous generations. And we see that amongst our students all the time. They are asking different questions, and they are pushing us to develop new curriculum for education, but also new research projects. So it's in that generation of new scholars we will find a lot of the right research questions and a lot of the solutions, I believe.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
Exactly. We might meet again in 10 years and discuss those questions. So turning to you, Ulrika, on the basis of what was just mentioned here about this security concept becoming ever more general and popular, I'm wondering, what is it like inside the UN? Can you tangibly notice a difference in how it's being talked about?
Well, I think it's a journey. When introduced in 1994, the human security approach, really, those who were there at the time or discussed the report at that time, perhaps at country level, it really refocused the security debate from territorial security to people security. But then I think, as was said in the beginning as well, if it was Jenny or Robert who also mentioned, that it is actually at the end of the day not focusing but broadening the understanding. And encouraging policymakers to look beyond protection of the nation state to protecting what is also really people's basic needs, physical integrity, our human dignity at the end of the day. And the concept of human security is about, Pedro said, everyone's right to freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from ignominy. So in that sense, it kind of encompasses both the traditional notion of security in a way, and of course in these days, our thoughts are really with also the people of Ukraine, but also then looking into much more complex issues in relation to security. And what we are trying to do, accompanying the Human Development Report as they now develop new concepts, but also, as Pedro shared with us, are looking back into concepts and how they should be understood today, is really to make use of it in relation to support to policy making at country level and in people's real lives, if you may say so. So multiple interconnected threats, that's really what it's all about. As we said, everything from digital technologies, from the increasing inequalities that both Pedro and I mentioned, that I think we have to stress as a real cause and a driver for the insecurity that we read about in the report. But then, of course, also, as we see today, so many countries and communities affected by violent conflict, but also health challenges, pandemics, climate change, the loss of biodiversity. All of this is really playing out at the same time. And no wonder then that people feel insecure, because it's really a complex situation that is developing around them. So I think that this accelerating planetary and social change, they have really given birth to a new generation of compounding threats to human security. And we need to look into how we understand them at the global level, but also then how people understand them from where they are. And yes, I think drill into what is really real, tangible threats, but also take into account, as we've discussed a number of times here already, that people's perception really matters to how also politicians take decisions and how policy is being shaped. And then once again, I think, and it really merits to be said again and again, the strategy of solidarity as a response, the strategy of agency as a response, to really see how we can understand this interconnectedness of threats. And to come to your question and be perhaps a bit more straightforward with an example, I do think that we see much of this. Now, UNDP, the United Nations Development Organization, is well placed, because in our mandate, we deal with everything from poverty reduction and addressing the increasing inequalities. We are the program that has the largest action with regards to climate change and biodiversity on the ground, implementing most of the work of the vertical funds working on both biodiversity and climate change. But we are also working with conflict prevention, and we are the agency that is most present in conflict-ridden countries. And what we see today is also an increasing number of increasingly protracted crises and conflict. And in these situations, the UN system, together with partners, has to look at how we can find system solutions to change. We have just issued, during COP, a really interesting study where we look at climate finance and how climate finance needs to be much more thought through in relation to conflict prevention, but also peace and stabilization issues, conflict sensitivity. So I think within the UN, we are seeing a change and a UN looking for more of system solutions. But having said that, I think like in any big bureaucracy, we also have a lot of colleagues still working somewhat in silos. And here's, of course, where it's incredibly important for us to be able to put something on the table that can also lay ground for the discussion, where we bring different entities together, whether it's the Department of Political Affairs, UNDP, UNEP, the environmental program. And one example, and Carolina, you're aware of this because we cooperate very closely with CIPRI, is, of course, the work we've done in relation to climate and security, where UNDP, together with UNEP and DPPA, really try to inform colleagues that work in more traditional fields about this interconnectedness and how people need to be much more informed about situations, but also be given tools and develop tools together on the ground to address a situation where we also see climate change also be an increasing part be an increasing conflict driver in many parts of the world.
Mm. Yes, thank you, Ulrika. I think that you made a nice segue into where I wanted to lead this now with Jenny, to look at, you have a background being the Swedish ambassador for 2030 agenda. So you're, of course, well aware of these interconnected problems ranging from environmental degradation, inequality, pandemics, as we're just hopefully exiting one, conflict, both abstract and practical issues, and close and far, and now and far in the future. As we can hear, it's a difficult mix of interconnected problems. But what can interconnected solutions and an unsiloed approach look like? Do you have any memories or examples of something that really seems to stand out?
I have memories and examples of scratching my head with this issue, which is so fundamental. I mean, it's a $1 million question: how to do this in practice in real life. from the government side, from the government offices. For example, we decided to report to Parliament with a bill on how we are working with the global goals. All the ministries were assigned to work with them. We will report regularly. I think the first report on how we're doing is coming up this spring. So it's administrative processes in a way, but actually to force this coherence in the yearly policy making. Because I mean, it's we need to nail it down to the concrete decisions that are taken. Are all aspects considered? But I'm sorry, I can't tell you about all these wonderful examples because it is a challenge. But we need to find ways to work with it. These are not new issues from a Swedish perspective. I mean, I think it was in the end of the 90s that we started this work with policy coherence. Many other countries have now followed, but we were pretty much in the leading group of working like that. But of course, it is really, really difficult. And I was thinking about, I mean, now when we have, first of all, we have the climate issues with all its aspects of connection to poverty, security, health, you name it. And then to add on to this, now we have the health-related issues because of the pandemic and all the effects that we haven't even seen yet, where I think there will be a lot of issues of priorities that will be really, really tricky, and long-term versus short-term. It's not just a theoretical challenge when it comes to, for example, resources now, when we need to rebuild better and greener, as we say, but which is definitely the ambition. But I think we need to work on the coherence, but there is no quick fix. Sorry about it, but we need, and reports like this, they do help because they remind us, and they put the stories, the numbers, the statistics out there, so we are helped in our work to push for this. So it's valuable, but no easy solution.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jenny. This is a report like this most certainly brings forward evidence that can bring some kind of clarity in the guiding of moving forward. But with this being very hard in practice, we clearly are able to discuss it in theory, and that leads me to you, Robert. The human security concept, you have a lot of insight into the academic debate about this and how that has developed. Do you want to share some thoughts about that you have gathered during the years of looking into the human security concept and the implications of the research findings, perhaps, on policy?
Yeah, well, it's a broad question.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, and I've been teaching on human security for many, many years, and so also then going through the history of it, and quite often when I push for it, because I'm also a believer, right? So I'm a bit of an activist in the human security area. So people always ask me, human security, isn't that old failed UN concept from back in the 90s? And I'm like, yeah, but there's also really interesting stuff going on. I would first of all say that it hasn't quite caught on in the academic world. And I think one of the reasons for it is that it's not analytically that useful in terms of understanding specific things and for theoretical reasons. So it's more of a policy agenda concept, and it's in that world where it's evolved as well within the United Nations. I remember when finally the human security approach was developed. I think it's now 6 or 7 years ago, perhaps, within the UN system. I thought that was a really interesting step that operationalized it and made it concrete. And now we've sort of taken the next step that I found really useful, adding solidarity as another tool, expanding sort of the types of threats we're looking at, and making sense of things in a way that I think is so relevant for the future. But there's one problem, because sometimes it sounds like it's just about figuring out how to tackle things and then doing it. And what we're sort of, the hypothesis here is, of course, that we have a really big complex world of social and ecological and political change, and people feel insecure, even though it doesn't really kill them, or even though they're richer and live longer and are healthier than ever before in history, so to speak. There's something going on, and it's sort of a cycle of fear, and that is related then to that sense of loss of agency that feeds distrust, and it's a vicious cycle downward. And I think the hypothesis here is that through the concept of solidarity, we can reclaim agency again. People can get engaged and get a sense of, I can control the future again through solidarity. In numbers, we can do. I can't, as an individual, affect human security globally. But as a community in solidarity, we actually have a chance. So why not just do it? Unleash the global civil society movements is sort of the policy solution then. And the problem here is that this is about power. Determining what security is, who it is for, and how to achieve it, that is the core to political control and power. So if states and political leaders release global civil society to do that for them, the question is, so what do we need states and leaders for? It is a direct challenge to the traditional concept of sort of state independence and sovereignty as well. And that's why I think it's so scary and easier to say than to do. Which politician would dare to allow the youth movements to control the agenda and the distribution of resources and power in society? I think that is the solution, but someone needs to take a very courageous step in order to do it.
Yeah, I think some of the things you mentioned here about even to have the power to control what security and whose security, and I think that's extremely relevant today, literally today, looking at state security, human security, whose security. But I am to move on to you, Ulrika, and ask you this Anthropocene that has been mentioned now many times and has also been brought up by previous human development reports as an ever more relevant concept in this time. It is clear that the current challenges are of our own making. So we need to redefine progress. But what does that actually mean in today's world?
Yeah, let me say something about that. But I was also tempted as I listened to Robert just to share also that a bit anecdotal that we had an exercise, Pedro Conceição leading the Human Development Report that is coming out also, our annual report in July or summertime in the global hemisphere. With civil society organizations. And Robert, to your point with regards to what is actually wished for, there was also quite a lot of discussion actually with these civil society organizations and also representatives of movement in relation to expectations of the state, that we actually need the state to be there to actually implement the concept of solidarity, and that the importance of really bringing these discussions also and holding states to account in relation to the recovery that needs to take place with such uneven conditions across the world, and how that can be done is really key. So that's also interesting that you see civil society organizations really pushing for the role of the state, and then of course thinking about the state that can actually also be the solution to many of these challenges and problems that this report, but also the upcoming report, will discuss with regards to increasing inequality, digital divide, and the Anthropocene, and all of this coming together in a very conflict-ridden world. Now, with regards to the concept of the Anthropocene, I do think that we see an increasing understanding in relation to the fact that humans have becoming a dominant force, which is shaping the planet. I mean, this is what the concept is all about. And to me, this really tells me, and I think that this is important, that we also can reshape what is happening. We can use our agents to actually do things differently. And of course, we will have a number of really alarming reports, one of them coming on Monday, I believe, from our IPCC colleagues with regards to the state of the world in relation to climate change. But having said that, there is also so much knowledge and ideas how to flip the script and turn this into a different story, where we can really understand how we need to look at both climate change, but also biodiversity, the whole entire ecosystem and the functioning biosphere as the only way for us to really build a sustainable future for all that is free from fear, but also where people can really have agency in relation to human rights, the wide range of human rights. Of course, one can be concerned that there will not be room for governments and the international community to address these important issues, because many countries are really struggling with the recovery. UNDP has accompanied the socioeconomic situation on the ground, doing the analysis in most member states among the least developed, but also middle-income economies, together with the World Bank. And we know that it will take years for countries to come back. So this is a concern that we see, that while the knowledge is there, we really have to find ways to showcase that a different economy will be an economy that will be beneficial for all in also the medium term and definitely in the long term. And here's also why UNDP is suggesting some really practical issues. We have taken on the discussion on fossil fuel subsidies. We invited a dinosaur to come into the General Assembly and share the story about extinction. But what we're also doing is to connect the possibility to open up the fiscal space if we start to roll back at least some of the subsidies that are not really conducive at the end of the day to our economies, to people, to the change that we need to see. And that countries can actually use that fiscal space to invest, let's say, in social protection systems. So this is what we're suggesting. So we are really trying to find these system solutions and offer also the United Nations and UNDP as a true global platform for learning, where different political economies can also share experiences through our platforms and see how can you take on, as a politician, the challenge to actually start to decrease subsidies, but then see the opportunity to do investments in people and perhaps also in planet to increase the notion of security, but also hope and solidarity, and also showcase quite straightforward. This is actually also good for economy.
Thank you, Ulrika. We have mentioned the word solidarity now multiple times, and agency, and the government, the state was mentioned a few times as an actor here that is quite crucial. So I can turn to you, Jenny, and just ask you on a few reflections on that, perhaps. On the solidarity and also the role of the government in making sure that solidarity in civil society can be promoted.
Oh, there are so many ways that at so many levels that this can be done and this can be improved. I mean, for example, through our development cooperation, we work a lot with supporting everything from human rights organizations, civil society, but actually also state institutions, so that they will be strong enough to be able to run a democratic society where there is room and space for the civil society, so that it is not a threat, but something that you draw upon for change, for policy change. So I mean, that is something we work with in many different ways through the development cooperation. But I think this is not only a matter for developing countries. I mean, this is something that we work with also here at home in Sweden. And of course, there is no perfect solution, but I think that in all levels, may it be local, regional, or national, this way of thinking must be there, and it's always room for improvement. And what worked I mean, civil society is also not something that is cemented. I mean, of course, there's also changes in that. I mean, you mentioned, for example, the Fridays for Future. I mean, that's something that is really something that have developed strongly, not something that we saw 10 years ago, right? So I think that the strategies we have using civil society is key to achieve this level of agency and solidarity that we are talking about. But how we do it, it's different in different places. But for the Swedish government, I mean, this is definitely key in our development cooperation. But I also always want to mention that we should not forget also that we need to build the democratic strength and resilience also in the institutions, so they do manage to use the people, the organizations, the movements, and that's so we have to work in two ways here.
Robert, you had...
Yeah, I was just thinking, because it's such an interesting question on the state solidarity. Is it a good or a bad actor, and how can we improve it? I mean, the pandemic just showed the ugly face of the state as it competed over resources, vaccines, but it also showed the best of humankind as we, in record times, developed new vaccines, distributed them fairly globally, at least, even though we have some issues with equitable distribution, obviously. But you can interpret it in both ways, right? And the question, obviously, for politicians of states is, what wins me in the next election? And that agency of being able to choose, because we're not just passengers in history here, we also have to choose. So clearly the problem is fear. People are insecure. How can I tackle that? Well, I can play into those fears. And that's what we're seeing a lot of populist politicians doing now. They're drumming up fear, and they're using it for political purposes, but it actually leads to more distrust, more fear. But I guess you could call the MAGA movement a sort of a civil society trend as well, right? That is growing from below. But we also have Fridays for Future, and as politicians, I think they have to somehow try and use their agency to shift the conversation to something more constructive and positive. But right now, I'm seeing very few who feel that the way to win the next election is to show great international solidarity in tackling the challenges of the Anthropocene. It's rather the opposite at the moment. It's close the borders, clash down on criminality, sort of using fears for other political purposes. And so in my sense, we're at a bit of a crossroads here, and it's time for the state and its politicians to step up and tackle the real issues of our time, rather than the narrow little fears that we can play into for populist reasons.
I think that's...
But it's easy for me to say as an academic on the sidelines of policy, right?
But can I chip in? I mean, it's not a new issue. I remember when I started with politics, I was at some communication course, right? And we were really discussing, how do you meet when someone claims a feeling of fear? I mean, often fear. It's difficult to say, you feel the wrong thing. I mean, that will not gain any trust, any confidence. How do you continue that conversation? But at the same time, nodding silently and playing on that fear. I mean, then we're doing what you mentioned, which is not the right thing. So it is very tricky. I mean, I'm just nodding because, and it's not new, but what is a paradox now, I think, is that, I mean, you mentioned the global issues, and at the same time we have this closing of borders and mindsets and looking only in our own backyard. It's such a paradox, considering how what we see is more and more global crises. It's, I mean, shining examples of issues that we cannot solve alone. But you see this movement of looking to inwards. It's very difficult to understand. I feel that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a bit unusual to have a UNDP HDR report coming out on a topic that is so applicable also in a country like this, that the feeling of insecurity is something you can read about also in local newspapers. Yeah. It's not really that abstract as other ideas that these big reports usually bring forward. So that's really interesting that it can tap into this populist agenda as well in a weird way. Ulrika, it's hard to see you when you want to come in, but please do if you have any comments.
No, but I was thinking about what Pedro, the lead author of the report, said in the very beginning, and that is the reminder that we see this across the world. So yes, we see it also in the global north, but also in one of the latest reports, actually ahead of the pandemic, we also saw some tendencies that were tendencies across the world, across different political economies, and that was, as I mentioned before, the increasing inequality. And how also the increasing inequality was accompanied also by an increasing fear in a way. So I think while, yes, we should be concerned, and I mentioned in the very beginning, the increasing disinformation and misinformation that we see and how this also can fuel this notion of insecurity, people also have reasons to feel that the world is changing very fast. And the main drivers that we stressed in relation to increasing inequality actually ahead of the pandemic was the digital divide and climate change. And I just think that these problems are so and tangible also in people's lives, but also for societies and for countries' economies that decision makers have to address them, or otherwise the problems will just increase. So it's it's populist, but it's also really short-termism, I believe, not to look into the facts and really understand what is at stake here. So once again, I think increasing inequalities and also in that report, Jenny, also relating to your comment in relation to gender in the very beginning, we could also see that the prejudice in relation to gender equality, also in relation to increasing inequalities, was actually increasing in the Nordics. So I'll send you the link to that report as well. It has a couple of years, but it's actually quite concerning. But some trends are really global, and increasing inequality with the digital divide as one of the main drivers is something that we are looking into and that you will see more of also in the upcoming report.
Thank you, Ulrika. You mentioned gender, Jenny, in the beginning. You mentioned gender, and Robert, I understand that this is something that you also have, been seeing the academic debate and research debate move forward on gender. What is that like in the security context at the Swedish Defence Uni to talk about gender? How is that received and how is it developed?
I mean, in the traditional security community, this has never been one of the key topics. But at the same time, the research on women, peace and security and gender aspects of war and the consequences of war and conflict situation on men and women, it is clearer and clearer all the time. So the data speaks for itself in many ways. But also looking at the agency of women increasingly and not just seeing them as passive victims of men's violence, etc. There's been so much movement on this. We're seeing more and more research everywhere, and of course, I'll have to brag a little bit. We obviously have a professor, an Anna Lind chair of gender, peace and security at the university, with a whole research team around them, and that would not have happened unless there was some real traction and interest in these issues, even within our traditional security community. We're also seeing armed forces around the world really working on these issues for internal and external purposes. How do we behave as an organization, but also how do we operate with a gender perspective when we're deployed? So there's a lot of movement going on in that field. And of course, from a human security perspective, you can't really talk about it without talking about the women. This is about individual perspectives on the ground. And women are simply half the population. Without understanding their situation, you do not understand human security.
Right. This does prompt me to look closer into the data on this one when it comes to the difference between the genders, really. I've been given the sign that we only have 5 minutes left. So I should ask you if you have any more takeaways, any messages, Jenny.
I was thinking about something that we didn't discuss so much, but it is the need to work with multilateral institutions or international organizations to improve the multilateral system. I think that with that we will gain more trust, and with more trust some of these issues of insecurity might be tackled. And we kind of forgot that dimension of this a bit, but I just want to raise the importance of the multilateral system as not a full solution, but as part of the solution for some of these issues. And we're very, we support, of course, our common agenda report of Secretary General, and also really happy that our former Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, has been asked to co-chair this high-level advisory board on the report. So a lot of wise words have been said. I will not try to summarize this with a quick sentence, but just also mention the international institutions, the role of them in this.
Yeah. Robert.
Yeah, I think the report achieves a lot of things. It presents data that is hugely interesting and that raises a lot of new questions and helps us understand the world better. I think the conceptual development of human security that is proposed here is absolutely spot on, and it gives us a new number of both analytical and sort of operational tools to work with. That I think we should. I mean, it's really interesting. Third thing I think it achieves is what Ulrika already highlighted: the fact that human security is no longer a concept from the West to tackle challenges in the South, so to speak. It is now something that is relevant to everyone, and I just think when we're doing that, we should avoid becoming, and then suddenly I say we as we in the North or West. We should avoid becoming too self-centric and sort of thinking that human security is sort of a postmodern fear society thing. It is also something extremely tangible in large parts of the world that are tackling huge threats to their who are simply not living with that freedom of fear, want, or a life in dignity. So let's keep in mind that there are different types of security issues within the human security concept, so that we don't use a one approach to all problems, because that's not going to work.
Yeah. Good point. Ulrika?
Yes. No, I have to say something in relation to Jenny's comments. Yes, for these global challenges, we need multilateral solutions. So I'm happy, Jenny, that you brought forward the importance of international cooperation. And just to say also that in the most conflict-ridden parts of the world, you nowadays see the hashtag of the UN, stay and deliver. It is the UN agencies that are on the ground now. UNDP is present in all parts of Ukraine. It is the UN who stayed in Afghanistan, and the story goes on. So I think the strength of having and revitalizing this global network, both for learning, as we do throughout these reports, and I really hope that a discussion can be picked up and taken on in Sweden. I think Pedro Conceição, our lead author from the Human Development Report Office, said in the very beginning that he was actually inspired to look closer into what the concept of human security means 2022 when he was in discussion with a broad range of actors in Sweden. So I hope that the discussion will go on, and that we also will see a very proactive Sweden in the UN setting, looking at how to support action based on this new way of thinking, or renewed way of thinking, that looks for system solutions, but also looks at this notion of solidarity as a possibility. It sounds very basic, but I do think that if people can understand that there is somewhat an enlightened self-interest to invest not only in your own house, but actually in your neighborhood, and that your neighborhood nowadays in a very interconnected world is actually the entire globe, and not only the globe and the people, the inhabitants, but also the biosphere as such.
Yeah.
So stress solidarity out of enlightened self-interest is perhaps a good start to try to get people to understand that we're in this together, and we are not, as Robert said, passive on the journey, but that we can actually make change happen if we have created an entire new way of looking at the geological age, the Anthropocene, we can change the course of this journey.
Thank you so much. And with those words, I also want to say, with the world moving so quickly, to have the Human Development Report Office also releasing these special editions of reports, actually drip feeding us with evidence as it builds up, I think that that's absolutely appropriate in today's fast-moving world. So thank you, all three of you, so much, and to everyone who has tuned in online as well. Thank you.